Well, hello, it's Andrew here again, and this is episode 114. Now, we're making a jump now. We've moved from the end of the Sermon on the Mount at the very beginning of Matthew chapter 8 to the beginning of chapter 15. Because I actually started at chapter 8, at about verse 5, when I started doing these series, because I was just quietly working through them on a personal level day after day, and I never imagined that I would carry on. So when I got to the end of chapter 14, I thought, better go back and start and do the Sermon on the Mount. So we've gone through looking at the whole of Jesus' adult ministry, from the time he started his baptism, and we've worked through. So if you've jumped into this sometime through and want to catch up on the intervening chapters where I started from, you probably need to go back to about episode 3, and it'll go through to about episode 65 from memory. So that'll be about where we are. So today we're at episode 114, and we've kind of caught up with ourselves. Matthew chapter 15 verses 1 through to 9. Then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus. Now Jesus has been doing a lot of stuff. He's been travelling around a bit. I think in the previous thing, in episode 65, in chapter 14, I think you'll find that Jesus was in Gennesaret, which was kind of in the arc of the top, what would you call it, the northwest of the Sea of Galilee. And that's where he's been, and he did some interesting healing there. People wanted to touch his clothes, and he done that. And he's travelled across the lake a few times, and there's lots of familiar part of the Gospels that have since happened since the end of the Sermon on the Mount. So here we are at the beginning of chapter 15. Then Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands before they eat. Wow, all the way from Jerusalem to ask that question. He answered them, And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, Honour your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that whoever tells father or mother, whatever support you might have had from me is given to God, then that person need not honour the Father. So for the sake of your tradition, you make void the word of God. You hypocrites! Isaiah prophesied rightly about you when he said, This people honours me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. Well, this is a day when there is no social welfare safety net. They don't have benefits like we have in this country, that when someone gets to an age and they need to retire, there's a certain amount of income that's provided. They don't have superannuation schemes, and certainly not things for the government to support people in terms of housing and healthcare and a basic weekly or fortnightly income for them to live on. So the responsibility becomes that of their children and of their wider family, assuming they have no children. So what we see here is, it would appear that the children's obligations to care for their parents could be avoided if the kids didn't want to do that. They didn't want to share their resources with their parents. And so, well, we've worked hard for this. Why should we now be burdened with looking after these people who have passed their use-by date? No longer able to profitably contribute in terms of work and effort. And so they would say then that they had dedicated the resources that the parents could reasonably expect to receive, the assistance and help that they could expect to receive. So, well, we've actually dedicated that to God, and it will be given to the temple. It's been set aside for that. So I'm sorry, we can't give it to you, because it's been earmarked for the worship of God. Now this is quite clever in a way, because what it does is it allows them at least to kid themselves that these resources are being used for a higher purpose. They've been dedicated to God. Surely God must smile upon that. And there's a sense of being able to salve their consciences and not actually looking after their parents. Now, it sounds awful. It sounds awful to me. It sounds awful. Yet, I kind of imagine that if everyone was doing it, if everyone was part of this kind of scam of believing that this is how things ought to be, there's nobody that's actually seeing there's anything particularly wrong with it. There may be a bit of a niggle that I'm not so sure about it, but well, the elders have determined and everybody else is doing it, so it must be okay. And what we're reminded again in this passage is of our readiness to see minor faults in others and failure to see the major ones in their own. So here they've come, these scholars and Pharisees come all the way from Jerusalem to challenge Jesus, it would seem, on this point. That his disciples weren't washing their hands before they ate food. And so Jesus immediately pushes back. He says, well, you've got another little loophole in terms of you meeting your obligations to your parents. And you're concerned about my disciples not washing their hands before they ate? See, Jesus sees with absolute clarity that the things that his disciples are not doing, which isn't prescribed anywhere, by the way, in the Old Testament, it's just not there. There's no requirement that you wash your hands before you eat food. If you look at the word wash and washings and wash, you'll see plenty about washing their clothes when they've been involved in activities that make them unclean, ritually unclean. There's nothing there about them washing their hands. The only ones that have to wash their hands on some rare occasions is the priests, as they're preparing the sacrifices, preparing to do the work of being the priest, but not the general everyday people before they eat. But they've made this regulation. And what Jesus sees is that they're prepared to literally throw their parents to the wolves and make a regulation that makes that okay, but they're going to challenge those who don't wash their hands before they eat. And I would guess it would also mean that for some there was potential income stream if they had rules like that. Give it to the church. The church needs it. God will honour you if you give. If you give generously, you will prosper, because God will know that you're serious about honouring Him. And so here they are. But what Jesus is pointing to is that they fail to see the respect and the honour and the care that is due their parents. After all, it's the parents that brought them into the world. It's our parents that actually nurtured us and looked after us when we were helpless, when we weren't able to do for ourselves. Our parents have invested a huge amount of time and energy and resources into us to enable us to grow to adulthood. I reckon the first kid cost you about $1 million, and it certainly makes a huge difference in terms of the lifestyle if you're going to have a family. And so here we are, recognizing that at the beginning we're totally dependent, and dependent for many years on our parents. And also recognizing that as we grow older, we become dependent on the children that we have raised. I've recognized that in my own life, it's been quite a number of years that I and my siblings have been parenting our mum, and before that briefly our dad before he died. It's the role you end up taking. You end up parenting your own parents. And I watch my kids doing it to me, particularly our middle one. He started parenting me, and I'm thinking, sometimes I'm actually okay with that. Because he's able to step in and do some things and speak into an environment that I'm kind of over, really. And so there's a sense of how things switch and move across. And so here we are. And there's going to come a day, I'd imagine, when that parenting of me and of Lynn, assuming we live old enough, is going to become increasingly more attentive. You see, Jesus is really concerned, and Scripture is really concerned, God is really concerned, that the weak and the vulnerable need to be cared for. And as we become older, that's what happens to us. We move into this category. And that we have a moral obligation to look after those who particularly could be dependent upon us, or have a right to be dependent upon us. And it all starts here, a conversation about looking after your old folks, because they want to challenge Jesus about his disciples not washing their hands. As I said, there's nothing in the law about it. And there's a sense that we know, I mean, I like to wash my hands, particularly if I'm eating with my hands, and I've been out. I wouldn't dream of having been in the garden and then eating fish and chips without actually washing my hands. I wouldn't dream of having been playing with the dog and stroke patting the dog and then just go away immediately and eating. I always have the sense of a need to wash our hands. And in the days of COVID, well, we know that washing our hands is actually really, really important. We could have claimed often, well, you know, it strengthens the immune system if you don't wash your hands. But we're living in a day and in a particular circumstance where actually we can't strengthen the immune system enough to protect us from that. So there's a sense to it of washing your hands, but they have made a regulation out of it. And I imagine that a ritualized washing of your hands, which is what they'd have been talking about, initially when someone started to do it, it would be out of recognition that eating itself is in fact a holy act. It's a recognition of the gift of God, the food that we have. It's actually taking it seriously. We ritualize this so that we eat and acknowledge the gift and the grace that is ours in receiving this food. But then it's become codified and turned into a rule that you need to wash your hands before you eat. And so they become highly offended when they see the followers of Jesus not doing it. And they would argue, as I've said, about a lot of things, that the little things matter, and they do matter. But I haven't said that the big things don't matter, because they do, even more so. And Jesus is pointing to the big things that matter, and caring for one another goes to the top of the pile. Caring for one another. You can't use it as an excuse that you've set this aside for God when you've got this screaming need right in front of you. This need which you actually are responsible for, and you're not meeting it because you say, no, I've given that to God. So it's challenging and it's interesting, I think. I mean, I don't know, we don't live in the first century. But there are some countries that actually aren't far away from it. They don't have the safety nets that we do. Yeah. Anyway, it's something to think about. God bless you.